But yeah, y'all. So we're gonna give you all an update on Sri Lanka. We've been wanting to cover this for a long time. It's tough because the situation is still so fluid. So we're gonna give you all an update and maybe more importantly, sort of fixate on how we got here. But I do just want to re-up immediately after the program. We're gonna be going over to the post game, where we're gonna be talking a little bit about how AMLO made a recent visit to the United States and schooled Sleepy Joe on FDR. And also, we really didn't want to have to dedicate too much time to this, but I think we need to. It's important. We're going to talk a little bit about this election in New York, in the New York Senate, where Nomiki has sort of stepped over a few lines recently in some of her allegations against Gonzalez there. So we're going to talk about that all in the post game. You can get access to that if you are so inclined at patreon.com. /left reckoning immediately after the main show finishes up.
Yep.
But yeah, let's go to Sri Lanka first. So people have probably seen a myriad of different images from the country, which has plunged into, chaos and upheaval after millions and millions of people have fallen into food insecurity, rampant corruption, and a very, very severe and it looks like, unfortunately, prolonged economic crisis has set in. I do think that it's worth just noting for some people who might not be particularly familiar with Sri Lanka, just a couple quick facts about the country. It is an island nation, 22 million people, and it has also been host to a very, very brutal and prolonged ethnic conflict between the major ethnic groups in the country. And all the things that go into this, it's important to remember that this is always sort of in the background, this history of pain and devastation that have really been with the country for a very long time, but it flamed over the past 100 years, particularly the past 50. But before we get into what got us here, let's sort of try to set the stage a little bit to where we are right now. This is courtesy of the good folks at Al Jazeera.
Sorry.
No worries. We'll get to that in a minute. Just watch this for a second.
They called Saturday D-Day, when protesters say the president and his government would be forced to step down. They blame Gotabaya Rajapaksa for an economic crisis that's made life unbearable for many of the country's 22 million people. After breaking through barricades, yet another unprecedented moment. The demonstrators stormed into the president's official residence in Colombo. Inside, this is what it looked like. The president was moved by his security team to an undisclosed location earlier, while protesters ransacked his bedroom and took photographs on his bed. Within moments, the presidential pool, once reserved for the country's top leaders, appeared more like a community pool.
Today is the Independence Day for me, being born in this nation, not 1948. Because today we have fought for our freedom from the tyranny, from the scoundrels, from the blackguards, from the rascals, the rogues, and the greedy politicians who have run our nation below ground zero.
The 73-year-old president was elected in 2019. Analysts say it's only a matter of time before he's forced to step down.
As soon as the president's resignation is announced, the prime minister becomes the acting president according to the constitution, and that is for a period of 30 days, within which Parliament must decide who amongst its members will be elected to serve the remainder of Gotabaya Rajapaksa's term.
Anger is rising at the government's handling of a dire economic crisis, the worst in 70 years. The monthly minimum wage is about $80, and access to food, fuel, and medicine is limited, and the government has run out of foreign currency. Rajapaksa's political allies know this is a crucial moment for his presidency.
I'd say so.
Certainly, and that's dated now. That was over the weekend. The prime minister who'd be assuming the presidential roles had the prime minister's office occupied in a similar fashion this week as well. So it's an extremely fluid moment. Before we get into some of like the economic factors that have caused this crisis, again, going back to the ethnic conflict, it's worthwhile remembering that Rajapaksa, the former president, um, is a member of a very, very influential and powerful family in Sri Lanka that was very dominant, particularly in the period of the Civil War. The war ended in 2009, where one of his brothers was basically one of the major leaders in the victory of the Sinhalese people over the Tamil separatists there, right? And it's just important to remember that like this is a country that already just a decade ago we're not far away from that reality and that kind of crisis. And remembering that the party in power is very much a kind of ethno-nationalist party as well. So there's a lot of factors that go into this now. This economic crisis certainly sparked this. The PM will be the next president. The prime minister will be the next president, Wickremi Singh. But he's seen as extremely close to the previous government. So he doesn't have a lot of legitimacy, as we can see from the fact that they have occupied his office as well. Remember, this is a country that's extremely indebted. Their debt load is something like $51 billion. Around 6 million people are food insecure. And this is not a small thing. This is not just sort of like we're rattling off stats from the CIA fact book. This food insecurity is a direct result of policy from the government. And we're going to do a full breakdown in just a second. But I just wanted to note, again, we can't do, a full breakdown of what's happening because it's literally changing every moment, and by the time this gets clipped as a video separately, the situation will be completely different. But sitting here right now on Wednesday, the prime minister has told the military to do whatever is necessary to restore order in the country, and has issued a state of emergency. So there will be security forces crackdowns in the near future, and seeing what will happen next, it's going to be extremely volatile, and we'll be watching that as closely as we can. But if you want to pull up this thread, Matt, I think that this is probably one of the better kind of breakdowns to help people understand the economic factors here. And you can find this entire thread. I've retweeted it, but it is by Ramakumar, who is an economist. And let's just break down. I didn't do the entire thread. It's worth checking out. I think I can read the other ones, Matt. If you're able to read that first one, that'd be helpful for me, though.
Sorry, Mike? I don't know what the hell that was. The mic just dropped. This version here. To begin with, Sri Lanka's economic growth rate was on decline from 2012 itself. Its GDP growth rate fell rather steadily after 2012. The post-war growth acceleration petered out soon, and current account the deficit widened in absence of export growth.
So we're going to talk more about this in a moment. I don't want to, utilize this to sort of make some points about some of the other political arguments that we have been in, but it is worth noting. You see this fall in GDP growth. Remember, Sri Lanka is a country that has been celebrated by many of the major figures of the degrowth movement. But let's move forward. The economy was stuck with the colonial era exports of tea and rubber, right? And that's something that's very difficult when you're an export-led economy. And garments. The exports of these commodities suffered as global commodity prices fell over the past decade, but two recent events in 2019 ended up imparting a major shock to the Sri Lankan economy. And these events were attacks by ISIS on the country, severe massacres. And this is a country that not only is an export driven economy, but it's also a country that is highly dependent on tourism. And I can't do a full breakdown of this concept for folks, but you have to remember when you're talking about countries, particularly in the developing world, that their ability to get foreign currency into their economy becomes very important, because most of the large, organizations that they'd be buying food or like finished goods from want to, they accept payment in dollars and maybe euros or maybe, Indian or Chinese currency, but typically it's the dollar, which dominates international trade. So tourism is a way to get money from foreign countries into your economy, and then after these terrorist attacks, people stopped feeling safe going to the country, which meant that there was a massive exodus of that kind of foreign currency in the country, and obviously much lower tourism revenues. This next one here. And while all this is happening, the president, who has now been deposed, cut taxes significantly across the board in the country. So at the same time where the economy is starting to contract because you're having these crises of lower tourism, also different movements in the global economy, which are basically making their exports less profitable for them, they also lowered the tax revenue of the country significantly, putting them in a weak position for what we all know is coming next, which is COVID-19. So you have a country that doesn't have a lot of capital, at hand for the government to use to sort of fund social programs and things like that in that moment. At a time where basically tourism is certainly shut down, production is shut down. I mean, every country in the world went through a recession during the COVID pandemic. It was inevitable, and they were in a weak position. So to deal with this, Sri Lanka has taken a lot of debt on. So they've taken a lot of people. By the way, I just want to make this point real clear and real quick. Really fixate on the fact that they owe money to China, and certainly China's a player there, but they owe money to IMF, they owe money to India, they owe money to a lot of different institutions. And so you have this crisis, and then of course, in the same way, when it comes to getting goods into your country, you're needing to use foreign exchange, foreign currency to do that. How do you think debt is denoted? It's not denoted in their currency, which means that then you have the crisis of having to get that currency. So you can either get that through things like tax revenue, through bringing money into the country through trade and tourism, or you buy them out in the open market. But again, if your currency is devalued compared to those things, it becomes harder and harder and harder for you to make those payments. So you have a situation where the country is now lowers their tax base, so they have less tax revenue in the first place, and then you're having this kind of monetary crisis as well. So a lot of things happened that were bad economic policy, bad economic planning, but also just hitting it all at sort of the worst time to create this crisis. And now let's get into this next factor, because this is what exacerbates the crisis in this country. So he notes here, this is where the organic farming lobby entered the scene to fish in muddy waters. Homegrown anti-science enthusiasts and external advisors like Vandana Shiva, who, if people are unfamiliar with, is somebody who is a big proponent of a lot of these kind of anti-science agricultural policies, pop figure, particularly with an environmental movement, and certainly somebody who you'll see if you ever go on a page like David Avocado Wolf or those kind of very granola Facebook mom pages, right? This is somebody who they celebrate a lot. This influence comes into the country, and they advise the president that the pressure on foreign exchange could be stopped if they stopped importing fertilizers. Now, he doesn't note that here specifically. What they mean by that is like a fertilizer that has any kind of chemical aspect to it. So like to only use natural, traditional ways of fertilizing crops, which again, the advances in science and agriculture have been incredibly beneficial to the human species. Our ability to produce food for people is incredible right now. And we are in this bizarre moment where it's not so much of a crisis of producing food globally, as much as it is a crisis of distribution. That's where capitalism comes into this factor. But in this situation, there's this kind of fixation. It's like, oh no, we're going against nature. We're going against the natural order by using natural things, just used in a different way to provide food for people. But also note that, so there's an organic aspect of it too, but the way that they were able to get the government to go along with this was basically by saying, well, you'll be spending less money importing fertilizer from other countries that produce this good, so you have more foreign exchanges to use for other things. This was an absolute disaster. So internally, the president, Rajapaksa, presented himself as an organic farming messiah. He banned all chemical fertilizer from May 2021. And you should read this blog post by Ramakumar there. It was written when this happened and really, unfortunately, predicted a lot of the damage that was going to end up happening. And maybe we'll talk about this. We can just get through this thread and talk about this at the end. But that specifically, this organic farming, this banning of fertilizer was something that was promoted heavily, not only by that kind of anti-science GMO crowd, but was promoted heavily by these degrowthers, people like Jason Hickel, who people were noting as this crisis was happening, that he was tweeting out in support of all this stuff as it was going on, that Sri Lanka is actually not just a good, what's happening there is good, but actually it is a global model, and this is a model that the rest of the world should be following. Just remember that. People get mad at us about what we say about degrowth. The reason that we get mad about it is because a lot of these policies spell very, very serious devastation and damage for people. And, he doesn't want to be associated with it anymore because he's deleted all of his tweets in praise of it since then.
Did Shiva blurb degrowth book?
I
maybe have to
100%
check that.
Yes.
Right, yeah.
I mean, I shouldn't say 100% because I could.
I think I saw she did.
I'm,
People can correct
I'm
us, but
almost
yeah.
certain about that. But let's get through this thread and then we can open it up because it's worthwhile understanding all these things. So the organic farming thing and that crisis really exacerbated it because it took something from a monetary economic crisis into an actual food crisis. And as we noted at the beginning, 6 million people in the country are struggling just to get enough calories on a daily basis because of this disastrous policy. This is zooming down a little bit in the thread. I highly suggest people read the full thing. But the IMF's intentions were deeply suspect as usual. So again, the country's gone towards the IMF, and which we know what happens when the IMF comes into a country. In 2016 itself, Sri Lanka had entered into a 36-month extended EFF arrangement with IMF for $1.5 billion to support an economic reform agenda. The conditionality of that set by the IMF was to reduce the fiscal deficit by 2020. What does that mean? Austerity. 16, the other IMF conditionalities follow the classic Washington consensus template. Reform of tax policy and administration, control over expenditures, commercialized state enterprises, exchange rate flexibility, boosted competitiveness, and free investment, and a free investment environment. So all these things are coming together at the same time. In all probability, Sri Lanka will now take out a new IMF loan with even more stringent conditionalities and move into yet another deflationary spiral. This, in the rightward shift in internal politics, will only worsen the conditions of the people's life and work. And that was in March 27. So more has happened since then, and as we've seen, it has sparked significant outrage. So much so that the president has been forced to resign, and he has fled the country to go to the Maldives.
That's horrible, and you don't like to see a practical demonstration of arguments you make. But I gotta say, the organic thing, keep that shit away from Green New Deal policy. It's unclear to me how much, Tucker was on board calling it a Green New Deal policy, and it's unclear to me exactly how much that's been put into the bills, because it's a really moving target what the Green New Deal is. But I have seen organic sort of groups say, hey, this is going to be good. And those folks need to be disappointed for this reason. You cannot fuck around with yields like that. This is real. Absolute, to stop importing fertilizers for economic reasons is insanity. And the left cannot be party to that.
No, it's extremely, extremely dangerous, especially when we're talking about world food systems that have become even more insecure, as our good friend Kowalski will remind us time and time again. I also just want to up something because someone noted in the chat that I said Jackson, I meant Jason Hickel, the degrowth economist. But yeah, no, I mean, I think that you're 100% right. Like people need to be very wary of this kind of stuff because there's these kind of ideas about how to be closer to nature. The stuff about trying to use less fossil fuels is good, but there's also an entire industry out there that has been trying to push, kind of irrational food production systems on people, and so that they can market certain products as better than others. Um, Nothing wrong necessarily if you want to have, an organic garden or farm even, but to do that as national agricultural policy is extremely damaging, because you need to make sure that there's enough food for people to be able to eat in your country. So if you wanted to understand like the context of this, understand it's like a convergence of a lot of different factors: a crisis, foreign exchange, a crisis of debt, bad policy making from, significantly cutting taxes across the board, having the kind of organic food lobby, anti-science people come into your country and accept their policy, suggestions, and obviously, COVID-19 and terrorism, but also a government that many people have felt for a long time has been extremely corrupt. And obviously in these things, people always want to know, well, what's going to happen next. I'm just going to sit here and say that I can't tell you what's going to happen next. I can tell you, where I start to investigate something like that is to understand, one, when the reaction is about corruption, it sometimes is difficult to have a vibrant political movement that comes out of it. Doesn't mean that doesn't ever happen, but when it's just solely a negative critique, and this is not against the protesters, what they're doing is 100%
Absolutely, yeah.
right. It's just trying to understand the dynamics at play, as to like what might happen next. All the people now who are upset about this, what is going to unite them? And there are really no guarantees that this is somehow going to be some kind of left-wing workers movement that will be taking place. What typically happens in moments of unrest is this whatever formulation that wasn't discredited with that former crisis that is the most organized. For example, when you see the crisis in the Soviet Union, it was the communists who were extremely, ready to go. In Egypt, when you saw the crisis, it was the Muslim Brotherhood, right? It's one of those things like this is just doing an analysis, understanding in crisis moments. It's like, who's the most organized, to be able to take advantage of a crisis like this? So I don't know what is necessarily going to happen. I do hope that they buck a lot of these policies, particularly food policies that have caused such devastation and unnecessary famine in that country.
Yeah, I mean that's got to be people's material well-being. That having a full belly, that's got to. I mean, that can't be fucked around with. Like I'll even be open to like experiments about um, pesticide-free farms, or whatever. You cannot implement that widely, and I think it's horrifying if that played such a role here.